I never imagined that a single morning could redefine my life entirely. Yet, that Wednesday dawned with a revelation so profound that it set me on a path I could never have foreseen. Up until that point, I had been proud to have recently earned the title of top cop at our local police department, a position that recognized my fresh ideas and hard work. As a newcomer in a force filled with veteran officers steeped in tradition, I worked diligently to learn their old-school methods while bringing in the new techniques I'd learned from my criminology classes at a state college some 40 miles away. I'd always taken a few extra case files home to study after hours. I believed that every unsolved mystery had an explanation waiting to be uncovered. In my first 6 months on the force, I managed to crack 4 cold cases, a feat that put me squarely on the radar of Sheriff Jim Stevenson. At the time, my wife, Stella, was very supportive. Working as a nurse at our local hospital, she rearranged her busy schedule to help us maximize the few hours we spent together. Our dreams were simple but heartfelt: a modest home with a little land where we could garden, raise horses, maybe even have a few other animals, and eventually welcome 2 or 3 children into our lives. We had built our lives on promises of mutual support and a future together, always planning for a time when it would just be the 2 of us. My success on those unsolved cases eventually led to an unexpected invitation. Sheriff Stevenson summoned me to his office with an extraordinary proposal. He wanted me to join his elite investigative team as a detective. The catch was that I would now report to his office, located in the county center, meaning a daily 27-mile commute instead of the previous 11. Yet, the offer came with enticing perks, a significant pay raise, a dedicated patrol car to take home, and even use for my criminology classes, and the promise that every minute spent in my courses would be compensated. As much as I hated the thought of leaving behind the camaraderie of my old colleagues, the sheriff's offer was too good to refuse. Moving to the district center, I found myself in an environment where competitiveness reigned. I knew that my rapid ascent had stirred envy among some of the older officers. Determined to keep my head down, I devoted most of my time to researching cold cases, much as I had done before. My routine was meticulous. I'd pore over every available document, commit as many details to memory as I could, and then record my thoughts in an evidence app. At the end of each day, I would transfer these ideas to a USB drive, which I'd take to work the following day. That routine, as steady as it seemed, was about to unravel my personal life in the most dramatic fashion. One Wednesday morning, I found myself frantically searching for my flash drive. I was certain I'd left it on my desk, yet when I returned, it was gone. After a thorough search, it occurred to me that perhaps it had been knocked off the table and ended up in the trash. I remembered that the previous night, Stella had taken our white plastic trash bag out with her when she left for work. Reluctantly, I rummaged through the garbage, digging through layers of discarded packaging. Deep down, after sifting through 3 layers of bags, I discovered not only the white flash drive nestled inside a black bag, but also, hidden beneath a clear sandwich bag, 6 small packets. These weren't just any packets. They were condoms, each one stuffed with a distinct white substance that any seasoned detective could identify without a lab's confirmation. In that heart-stopping moment, I realized with dawning horror that my marriage was on the brink of complete disintegration. The discovery of those packets was more than a hint, it was a direct signal that Stella had betrayed me. Even as my mind reeled with shock, I maintained the detachment of a trained investigator. I locked the bag of condoms in the evidence cooler of my squad car, already plotting my next steps. My initial impulse was to confront Stella immediately. Yet I knew that a direct accusation could be met with denials or ridiculous explanations. For instance, she might claim that local troublemakers had somehow misused our trash can. Instead, I resolved to set up a discreet, professional surveillance system at home. I needed hard evidence to determine if this was an isolated incident or a chronic pattern of infidelity. With the new equipment, I could later run DNA tests on the condoms if necessary. I made a list of the equipment I'd need and began planning the installation. Before I could finalize my home investigation, my phone rang. It was Assistant Sheriff Jake Robbins on a call from Sheriff Stevenson. The sheriff informed me of an unexpected development in one of our cold cases. Alice Reynolds' car had been discovered on Luke's property. Even more, the sheriff had decided to place me in charge of this reactivated case. It was the first time in my 2 years on the job that I would lead an investigation, and I felt honored, even as my personal world was collapsing. On the way to the ranch where the car was located, my mind involuntarily drifted back to another conversation with Luke. Earlier that day, Luke had called me to discuss a separate mystery, the unsolved murder of Holly Sherman. Over lunch, Luke had revealed startling details about a party at Holly's house. He confessed that he had participated in a group encounter with Holly, describing a scenario that, although unconventional, he insisted was consensual. He explained that Holly's participation waned over time, though she never explicitly said to stop. Luke's discomfort led him to eventually confess the entire episode to his brother, a local minister, who advised him to come forward with the information to the police. I listened intently, questioning him about every detail. Was it rape? Did anyone force Holly? Luke assured me that nothing illegal had occurred, though he mentioned the names of the other participants, Stefan Barber and Bill Raymore, at Stefan's invitation. I couldn't help but note the irony that Stefan, who was supposedly Holly's boyfriend, had initiated such an encounter. Although none of this constituted a criminal offense, I knew that any further inquiries might shed light on Holly's mysterious poisoning. I began a thorough investigation. I ruled out Stefan as a suspect and, despite some incriminating behavior, found insufficient evidence to charge Bill Raymore with murder. Instead, my attention shifted to his wife, Ellie Raymore. Digging through her past, I learned that before moving to our town a year ago, she had been employed by a chemical company on the Gulf Coast. Multiple phone calls with her former supervisors confirmed that she had access to a chemical identical to the toxic substance that the medical examiner had identified as the cause of Holly's death. Within 3 days of this discovery, my team secured a search warrant for Ellie's home. When she answered the door, I flashed my badge and announced that we were investigating her involvement in Holly Sherman's death. Her reaction, a smug, almost mocking grin, sent a chill down my spine. It was as though she relished the moment, knowing that her secrets were unraveling. Though I had played a significant role in cracking this case, a part of me knew that much of the real credit belonged to Luke, whose earlier disclosures had set the investigation in motion. But the professional accolades did little to distract from the turmoil brewing in my personal life. In a few days, I was to meet Luke again about another cold case that had long puzzled the community, the simultaneous disappearance of Alice Reynolds and a young man named Jerry Gibson. Alice, a teacher in a special program for mentally challenged young men, had taught Jerry, raising suspicions about the nature of their relationship. Rumors had swirled for years. Had they secretly become romantically involved, or was their disappearance simply an eerie coincidence? The case had long since been closed, but now it was time for a fresh investigation, and I wondered if Luke, whose contributions had been invaluable in the Holly Sherman case, might be able to help again. Driving up to Luke's house, I noted that the forensic team's vehicles were already parked at the scene. Luke greeted us warmly as we shook hands. The forensic lead asked about a car that Luke had mentioned, the car that might hide further evidence. Luke directed us to a nearly forgotten, white 2-year-old Bic parked amid a collection of classic cars in what looked like a family car graveyard on the ranch. The dealership, once a well-known family business specializing in Fords, had long since accumulated a stock of old and used vehicles. Over the years, some had been auctioned off, but many ended up neglected in the vast lot. One curious collector had recently asked about the price of this Bic, prompting Luke to check on it. Although the doors were locked, the license plates remained, prompting Luke to make several phone calls to the sheriff's office. Finally, we gathered at the vehicle. Forensic experts opened the car's doors and trunk, finding a couple of empty drink cups and holders but no traces of blood, no other evidence, and notably, no bodies. I then asked Luke if he could recall a location on the property where bodies might have been concealed. After a moment's thought, his eyes brightened with recollection. An old hand-dug well, situated a short distance from the car. Forensic scientists confirmed that the well was at least 12 feet deep, and soon they installed a camera inside it. After carefully reviewing the images, the operator's analysis confirmed our worst suspicions. There were 2 bodies in the well. I immediately called my superior to report the discovery. He congratulated me and informed me that a specialized team would be assembling to retrieve the bodies by dawn the next day. I felt a mixture of professional triumph and personal emptiness as I watched the crime scene tape being carefully wrapped around the well and the car. Once my field duties were complete, my mind turned back to the burning question of the 6 condoms. With a couple of spare hours before I returned home, I made a detour to an electronics store and purchased 4 state-of-the-art smoke detectors equipped with audio and video recording. They looked identical to those we already had in the house, and along with a base station to record their output, I installed them in strategic locations around our home. I arrived back at the house more than an hour before Stella was due to return. I hoped that these devices would soon provide answers, even if the revelation might signal the end of my marriage. When Stella finally came home that evening, I carefully masked my inner turmoil by explaining that I had been busy leading a new case, one involving a teacher and her student who had mysteriously disappeared. Stella listened with interest, and for the rest of the evening she appeared relaxed, cheerful, and loving. To an outsider, it would have seemed as though nothing was amiss. Yet inside me, the seed of suspicion had taken root, and every small detail was now viewed in the context of betrayal. Later that night, while revisiting the files on the Alice Reynolds and Jerry Gibson case, I stumbled upon a note left by a school administrator. The note mentioned that Jerry had approached Alice for advice about dating, a seemingly innocent request that, in hindsight, hinted at a deeper involvement. I began to suspect that their relationship had spiraled out of control, with Alice perhaps realizing too late that her involvement with Jerry had put her entire family in jeopardy. It was a tragic pattern, the betrayal of trust, the crossing of boundaries, and the inevitable fallout that followed. As midnight approached, I decided it was time to test the intimate connection that had once defined my relationship with Stella. I believed that our physical closeness might provide clues about her fidelity. However, as I attempted to rekindle our intimacy, I was struck by her apparent disinterest. Although she uttered the familiar sounds and words that were expected in such moments, her body language was different. There was an absence of the usual warmth and responsiveness. The lack of the familiar pressure I normally felt during her climax, coupled with erratic breathing, confirmed my growing suspicions. Her declining passion over the past month had not gone unnoticed, and now I was forced to acknowledge that something was terribly wrong. I decided to arrange another intimate encounter in hopes of provoking a reaction, perhaps a refusal that might confirm my worst fears. Yet, while she did not outright turn me down, her involvement was even less enthusiastic than before. After our second encounter, instead of the customary tender afterglow, I simply got up, left the bed, and walked to the bathroom. When I returned and turned my back to her, she reached out in a quiet attempt at connection, but I remained distant. My heart was heavy with betrayal and regret, and each passing moment deepened the isolation I felt within my own home. The following day, I oversaw the forensic team as they collected the bodies from the well. The grim scene was dissected in lengthy discussions with the forensic experts. They maintained that the case likely involved a murder-suicide, a conclusion that provided some closure on a professional level. After finishing a series of reports and a pre-press briefing, I returned home much later than usual. My superior, pleased with the progress in the case, even granted me a day off as a reward. I kept this bonus secret from Stella, intending to use the extra day to pursue the case that now intruded upon my personal space. That night, after a long day filled with professional conquests and personal heartbreak, I recounted my day's events to Stella. I detailed the progress at the ranch and the retrieval of the bodies without mentioning any of the extra time I had claimed for myself. Later, as I tried once again to initiate intimacy, Stella unexpectedly told me she wasn't in the mood. I was left to wonder, was it mere fatigue, or was it a sign that she had already experienced another encounter? Earlier that morning? The question haunted me. Would I find another package of evidence, another indication of her infidelity? The following morning, after Stella had left for the day, I returned to the trash once more. This time, I found no trace of any additional condoms or evidence to corroborate my suspicions. With mounting dread, I turned my attention to the home surveillance recordings from the previous day. There were two devices in particular, the one in our living room and another in the guest bedroom. Sitting in front of the screens, I began to piece together the events of Thursday. The footage from the living room was the most damning. It showed Stella opening the door just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. As she welcomed two men inside, she greeted them with kisses and warmth, gestures that I recognized all too well from previous encounters. I remembered them clearly. They were the same men who had visited us during the summer, individuals I had once met and even been introduced to by Stella. Watching the recording, I felt the final strands of our shared dream unraveling before my eyes. Each passing moment on the screen drove home the painful reality. While I had dedicated myself to solving crimes and restoring justice, I had been blind to the slow disintegration of my own marriage. Every successful case and every accolade on the job now seemed hollow in the face of the intimate betrayal captured by my own home's cameras. Professional triumphs and personal despair had merged into one relentless nightmare. I had always believed that my work would one day be my solace, that my dedication to finding the truth would serve me well. Instead, it had led me to a crossroads where the truth about my professional cases, murder-suicides, missing persons, and chemical poisons, paled in comparison to the agony of betrayal by the person I once trusted completely. That evening, as I sat alone in the dim glow of my study, I replayed the footage over and over in my mind. I saw Stella welcoming the men as if greeting old friends and felt the cold certainty that our once bright future was now shrouded in darkness. The dreams of a modest house, a garden, and a family were now in ruins, replaced by a painful awareness of deception and the loneliness of betrayal. I began to realize that my work on unsolved cases, the meticulous documentation, the careful research, and even the adrenaline of field operations, had prepared me for the worst of human nature. Yet nothing had prepared me for the destruction of trust within my own home. The very methods I employed to track down elusive criminals were now being turned on my own life, and every piece of evidence, every grain of data recorded by my new surveillance devices, only confirmed that my marriage was falling apart. In that moment of stark clarity, I acknowledged that I was facing two battles at once. On one side, I had a series of intricate, high-stakes investigations demanding my full attention. On the other, I was embroiled in a deeply personal crisis, a betrayal so profound that it undermined everything I once held dear. The line between professional duty and personal agony had become dangerously blurred, leaving me to wonder how much of myself I could still salvage from the wreckage. The detective in me was driven by an unyielding pursuit of truth, whether it was uncovering hidden bodies in a remote well or exposing a carefully concealed lie at home. Now, however, that same drive was forcing me to confront a truth that cut deeper than any criminal act I'd ever investigated. I had to face the reality that Stella's actions had irrevocably altered the foundation of our shared life. The surveillance footage, the discarded condoms, and her apathetic behavior in our most intimate moments were undeniable proof that the marriage we had built was crumbling under the weight of her betrayals. As I sat there, sifting through the recordings and evidence, I resolved that I could no longer continue to live in denial. Whether the outcome would lead to a final, painful confrontation or an attempt at reconciliation was uncertain. What I did know was that I had to gather every shred of evidence to decide my next move. I began compiling detailed logs of her movements, annotating every recorded interaction, every unexpected visitor, and every moment of disinterest that contrasted sharply with the loving partner I once knew. In the following days, every aspect of my life was consumed by this dual investigation. By day, I led teams, coordinated with forensic experts, and delivered breakthrough after breakthrough in cases that kept our community on edge. By night, I combed through the silent testimonies of my home surveillance footage, each clip serving as a painful reminder that the truth of my personal life was no less elusive than any cold case I'd tackled before. I eventually realized that my professional journey, solving unsolvable cases and exposing hidden conspiracies, had ironically left me ill-prepared for the ultimate mystery of my own failing relationship. The bitter irony was that while I had prided myself on my ability to sift through clues and uncover deceptions in the criminal underworld, I had remained blissfully unaware of the betrayal occurring in the sanctuary of my home. Now, each new piece of evidence chipped away at the facade of the life I had once known, leaving behind a stark and unrelenting truth. Standing at this crossroads of duty and heartbreak, I knew I had to make a decision. I could either allow the weight of betrayal to consume me entirely, or I could confront the painful reality head-on, armed with evidence and a determination to reclaim some semblance of the truth. As I prepared for the inevitable confrontation with Stella, I took solace in the fact that my career had taught me to remain steadfast even in the darkest of times. It was now time to apply that same resolve to the most personal and painful case of all, the case of my shattered marriage. My story has become one of dual investigations, one that chases down the elusive threads of criminal conspiracies and another that searches for the truth behind a broken promise. And as I continue this difficult journey, I know that every piece of evidence, from the hidden flash drive and discarded packets to the silent recordings in our living room, has led me to this irrevocable truth. Whether this marks the end of my marriage or the beginning of a new chapter in rebuilding trust, only time will tell. For now, I stand ready to face the consequences of a betrayal that has forever altered the course of my life. In the end, my pursuit of truth, both professionally and personally, has become inseparable. The detective who once celebrated every solved case now finds himself fighting the hardest battle of all, the battle to understand how love could turn to betrayal, and how a shared dream can dissolve into a series of devastating revelations. This is my story, a story of triumph and despair, of professional success shadowed by personal loss, and of the painful realization that sometimes the greatest mystery to solve lies within one's own heart. That week was a blur of pain, confusion, and betrayal. I had just been arrested, and while I was recovering indoors with several cuts along my arms and chest, each wound carefully bandaged so as not to risk infection, I kept myself confined inside. My only distraction was a half-hearted fixation on a sports broadcast, though my mind was far from the game on TV. I had no reason to suspect that anything unusual was happening at home. After all, the two men in question were, by all accounts, my wife Stella's cousins. In the living room, a few minutes into what was supposed to be a relaxed conversation, I overheard snippets of reminiscence that sent shivers down my spine. The cousins were casually recalling an episode of swimming in our pool, a pool I later learned had a secluded area hidden from the view of our windows. Stella herself had once mentioned that they deliberately chose that part of the pool so as not to be seen. In that moment, my mind began churning. Had this been a one-time stunt or a long-standing habit? Were they involved romantically long before anything had changed between Stella and me? I tried to rationalize the situation. After all, they were all adults acting by mutual consent. Yet, nothing could justify the fact that my wife was one of them. As the conversation unfolded, more details emerged. The cousins casually mentioned that they attended a state university roughly 50 miles away, a detail that instantly recalled previous visits when they had mentioned that neither of them had classes on Tuesdays or Thursdays. Suddenly, a long-standing mystery began to piece itself together. Stella's work schedule had abruptly shifted that fall. Previously, she had worked for 10-hour days from Monday to Thursday. But then, almost overnight, her hours changed. She began working 13-hour shifts on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, coupled with 2 short 2-hour shifts on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Officially, management had instituted the new schedule, but I couldn't shake the suspicion that the changes had been orchestrated at her behest. After all, those short mornings meant she was home by noon on the days when her cousins visited. I tried to dismiss the oddities in our conversation, but nothing could prepare me for what I later discovered in the guest bedroom. There, I witnessed an act that defied simple categorization. Orgy seemed almost too tame a word for what unfolded. First, the trio helped each other undress. Then, as intense foreplay escalated on the bed, one of the cousins nonchalantly produced a handful of condoms. In the midst of this physical display, Stella announced in a tone that mixed mischief with nonchalance, "Today, I have good news for you guys. I've been taking the pills for 10 days now, I'm sure we'll all enjoy it." One of her cousins remarked in surprise that she might be trying to have a baby. Stella's response was equally candid. "Jake and I are officially trying to get me pregnant, but I've put it off for obvious reasons." My mind reeled. How could she suggest such a plan, and more importantly, how could this possibly be acceptable without Jake's knowledge? She continued, explaining that if Jake ever learned about my taking those pills, it would only raise questions I wasn't prepared to answer. "I can't live without what the three of us have," she insisted, "but I also don't want to lose Jake in our marriage. So, what he doesn't know won't hurt him." Her words were cold and calculated. As the sexual display continued, she later moaned about my apparent indifference. I remembered her remark about the last time we'd been intimate. Once we finished, I'd immediately retreat to the bathroom, leaving behind the cherished moments of gentle afterglow that once defined our lovemaking. "I miss that time," she admitted in a soft, regretful tone. "I enjoyed the afterglow as much as the sex itself." She went on to confess that she had begun avoiding marital sex on Tuesdays and Thursdays, claiming a lack of desire, though I suspected that she was simply too full or too cautious to risk me noticing something amiss. It wasn't just the physical act that unsettled me, it was also her admission that she noticed my discontent. She reminded me that I had never before refused her advances until these so-called cousin dates began. Adding salt to the wound, she pointed out that I hadn't even attempted to initiate intimacy lately. A slew of images and feelings washed over me, the video capturing every explicit moment, the carefree ecstasy on her face as she reached the climax of each encounter, and my own revulsion as I realized that, in her eyes, these acts were merely routine. For her, what we once shared as a sacred marital bond had become little more than an itemized list of physical transactions. I was stunned into inaction. That evening, after watching the incriminating video, I called a divorce lawyer and managed to secure an appointment for Monday afternoon. Over the entire weekend, I deliberately avoided Stella. She tried, repeatedly, to reach out and rekindle our former intimacy, but I refused. There were no kisses, no embraces, and no whispered words of love between us. I was done trying to salvage a marriage that felt irrevocably broken. It wasn't long before Stella mustered the courage to confront me. "Honey, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of resignation and desperation. I braced myself for what was to follow. She began haltingly, admitting that she knew something was terribly wrong. "I never kissed you again after that day, nor did I try to have sex with you." "What did I do?" she asked. I replied, "You seemed to feel guilty about something." I tried to explain that I felt guilty for turning you away, yet I couldn't understand how I could be at fault if I hadn't been given a reason to feel guilty. "Think about everything you've done these past few months," she insisted. "If you can pinpoint something that might have hurt me, we'll talk about it. But if nothing comes to mind, then perhaps it is my fault. Tell me, Jake, is something bothering you? Did I say or do something to upset you?" Her words cut deeper than any physical wound. I remained silent, unable to articulate a response that might ease her pain. Instead, I listened as she broke down in sobs. "My God," she choked out, "you just admitted that I never gave any sign that something was wrong. I asked you to reflect on your actions, but you couldn't name a single thing. It feels as though we're caught in some twisted standoff." I left the room, burdened by the weight of our mutual confusion and heartbreak, while she continued to cry. For the remainder of that turbulent weekend, we lived together as if we were mere roommates. Monday arrived with a heavy sense of inevitability. I took a long lunch break to meet with my lawyer, gathering the video evidence and every piece of documentation I could muster. After a careful review of the footage, he told me bluntly that our state permitted filing for adultery, and that the video left no room for doubt. He even retrieved some of the condoms from my evidence refrigerator, sending them to the lab for further testing, promising that this additional evidence would only solidify our case. According to him, the settlement would be simple, with the divorce documents ready by Wednesday. It was decided that I would personally serve Stella at home. Despite the deep betrayal, I couldn't bear the thought of humiliating her publicly at work. I left the meeting feeling numb. A part of me should have rejoiced at the thought of finally freeing myself from this farce, yet all I felt was overwhelming betrayal and confusion. I loved Stella with every fiber of my being, but the vivid memory of her explicit declarations, the words spoken in that damning video, would forever haunt me. When I returned home on Monday evening, Stella was a bundle of nerves. She apologized for not preparing dinner. I merely ordered pizza on my phone. "I'm sorry, Jake," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm just so upset. I barely made it through work today. I'm a wreck. Please forgive me for everything I did to upset you so much." I tried to recall a time when she had ever given me reason to be upset. "Stella," I said slowly, "I don't remember you ever mentioning anything that might have bothered me. I've never heard you complain before." But she pressed on. "Jake, you treat me like a stranger. Tell me, why is it that you no longer touch me? It feels like you don't love me anymore, that you've lost all desire for me." I recalled the times when I'd tried to initiate intimacy, only to be met with her curt refusals. "I remember when you said you weren't in the mood, last Tuesday, the Thursday before that, and even the Tuesday prior," I reminded her. "Before, during our marriage, you never mentioned feeling off until these new work schedules started. Now, on your 10-hour days, you let me have sex with you, but it's like you're just going through the motions. It's as if you're doing your duty rather than engaging in an act of love." Her eyes filled with tears as she pleaded, "I don't want any of that anymore. I don't want to risk being hurt or humiliated again." I pressed further, asking, "Are you saying you're done with our marriage? That you want me to leave?" "It all depends on you, Stella," I said quietly. "Everything depends on you. How can I possibly do anything if you don't give me a chance? You treat me like a roommate rather than the husband I once was." In that moment, I turned away from her, settling into my chair and attempting to focus on a PBS news program that played silently in the background. Soon, her phone rang. "Honey, I have to take this," she murmured, and with a heavy sigh, she retreated into our bedroom, closing the door behind her. I knew enough by now, thanks to my modified smoke detectors, which I'd ingeniously linked to a base station via my laptop, to understand that I could listen in on her conversation in real time. I grabbed my headphones and tuned in. Her voice was soft but resolute as she spoke with her cousins. They confirmed that no one else was present, and she went on to say, "I have to cancel this. Jake is acting very strangely. I don't know what he knows, but he certainly knows something." One of them ventured, "Are you sure he knows? Maybe he's just suspicious." But she snapped back, "It doesn't matter. He's cut me out of his life. We're just roommates now, he doesn't even touch me anymore. I need to change everything." "Fine, we'll miss tomorrow. Maybe by Thursday, things will be different." She continued, "I'm not canceling just tomorrow, I'm canceling everything. You said it yourself, Stella, now you live in two different worlds. You need both, I suppose, but one of those worlds is falling apart, and I have to put it back together. Everything else is disposable, but not my marriage. Do not show up tomorrow, or any other day, unless you call ahead. You can visit me anytime, but only if Jake is present." Her words, measured and final, hinted at a last-ditch attempt to regain control even as it became increasingly clear that we were too far gone. The following day, after returning from lunch on Tuesday, I received a call from Stella. Her voice carried a tired resignation as she informed me that she was no longer going to leave early on Tuesdays and Thursdays. "I told my manager that the new schedule just wasn't working for me," she explained. "So, he changed it back to 14-hour days from Monday to Thursday. I just want you to know not to expect me at home when you get there." I replied, "I thought you mentioned that management had introduced the change. I'm surprised they reversed it so quickly at your request." "I was surprised too," she said, "but apparently, they didn't understand how upset I was. They said they had been considering bringing things back for a while anyway, and my request just accelerated the process. I'm glad it worked out." After we hung up, a gnawing suspicion took hold of me. Was this new schedule merely a cover for moving our so-called orgy to another location? Perhaps that phone call the previous night had been a ruse, a carefully constructed lie. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I dialed her office phone. After a couple of rings, she answered, and in the background, I distinctly heard Mary and June chatting casually. She was indeed at work, just as she'd said. Regaining my composure, I quickly added, "I forgot to ask, do you want me to pick up something to eat for tonight?" Her response was upbeat, "That would be great, thanks for thinking about it. See you later." As I drove home, the weight of her lies began to crystallize. Passing by Mary's gift shop, I was drawn to a striking sign displayed in the window. It read, "Avoid even the appearance of indecency." I slowed down to study it, and before long, Marcy, the shop's attentive owner, approached me. Perhaps it was my badge, which she quickly noticed, as she remarked, "There's a story behind this product, Officer Robbins." I explained that I liked the sign because my boss. For the remainder of that turbulent weekend, we lived together as if we were mere roommates. Monday arrived with a heavy sense of inevitability. I took a long lunch break to meet with my lawyer, gathering the video evidence and every piece of documentation I could muster. After a careful review of the footage, he told me bluntly that our state permitted filing for adultery, and that the video left no room for doubt. He even retrieved some of the condoms from my evidence refrigerator, sending them to the lab for further testing, promising that this additional evidence would only solidify our case. According to him, the settlement would be simple, with the divorce documents ready by Wednesday. It was decided that I would personally serve Stella at home. Despite the deep betrayal, I couldn't bear the thought of humiliating her publicly at work. I left the meeting feeling numb. A part of me should have rejoiced at the thought of finally freeing myself from this farce, yet all I felt was overwhelming betrayal and confusion. I loved Stella with every fiber of my being, but the vivid memory of her explicit declarations, the words spoken in that damning video, would forever haunt me. When I returned home on Monday evening, Stella was a bundle of nerves. She apologized for not preparing dinner. I merely ordered pizza on my phone. "I'm sorry, Jake," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm just so upset. I barely made it through work today. I'm a wreck. Please forgive me for everything I did to upset you so much." I tried to recall a time when she had ever given me reason to be upset. "Stella," I said slowly, "I don't remember you ever mentioning anything that might have bothered me. I've never heard you complain before." But she pressed on. "Jake, you treat me like a stranger. Tell me, why is it that you no longer touch me? It feels like you don't love me anymore, that you've lost all desire for me." I recalled the times when I'd tried to initiate intimacy, only to be met with her curt refusals. "I remember when you said you weren't in the mood, last Tuesday, the Thursday before that, and even the Tuesday prior," I reminded her. "Before, during our marriage, you never mentioned feeling off until these new work schedules started. Now, on your 10-hour days, you let me have sex with you, but it's like you're just going through the motions. It's as if you're doing your duty rather than engaging in an act of love." Her eyes filled with tears as she pleaded, "I don't want any of that anymore. I don't want to risk being hurt or humiliated again." I pressed further, asking, "Are you saying you're done with our marriage? That you want me to leave?" "It all depends on you, Stella," I said quietly. "Everything depends on you. How can I possibly do anything if you don't give me a chance? You treat me like a roommate rather than the husband I once was." In that moment, I turned away from her, settling into my chair and attempting to focus on a PBS news program that played silently in the background. Soon, her phone rang. "Honey, I have to take this," she murmured, and with a heavy sigh, she retreated into our bedroom, closing the door behind her. I knew enough by now, thanks to my modified smoke detectors, which I'd ingeniously linked to a base station via my laptop, to understand that I could listen in on her conversation in real time. I grabbed my headphones and tuned in. Her voice was soft but resolute as she spoke with her cousins. They confirmed that no one else was present, and she went on to say, "I have to cancel this. Jake is acting very strangely. I don't know what he knows, but he certainly knows something." One of them ventured, "Are you sure he knows? Maybe he's just suspicious." But she snapped back, "It doesn't matter. He's cut me out of his life. We're just roommates now, he doesn't even touch me anymore. I need to change everything." "Fine, we'll miss tomorrow. Maybe by Thursday, things will be different." She continued, "I'm not canceling just tomorrow, I'm canceling everything. You said it yourself, Stella, now you live in two different worlds. You need both, I suppose, but one of those worlds is falling apart, and I have to put it back together. Everything else is disposable, but not my marriage. Do not show up tomorrow, or any other day, unless you call ahead. You can visit me anytime, but only if Jake is present." Her words, measured and final, hinted at a last-ditch attempt to regain control even as it became increasingly clear that we were too far gone. The following day, after returning from lunch on Tuesday, I received a call from Stella. Her voice carried a tired resignation as she informed me that she was no longer going to leave early on Tuesdays and Thursdays. "I told my manager that the new schedule just wasn't working for me," she explained. "So, he changed it back to 14-hour days from Monday to Thursday. I just want you to know not to expect me at home when you get there." I replied, "I thought you mentioned that management had introduced the change. I'm surprised they reversed it so quickly at your request." "I was surprised too," she said, "but apparently, they didn't understand how upset I was. They said they had been considering bringing things back for a while anyway, and my request just accelerated the process. I'm glad it worked out." After we hung up, a gnawing suspicion took hold of me. Was this new schedule merely a cover for moving our so-called orgy to another location? Perhaps that phone call the previous night had been a ruse, a carefully constructed lie. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I dialed her office phone. After a couple of rings, she answered, and in the background, I distinctly heard Mary and June chatting casually. She was indeed at work, just as she'd said. Regaining my composure, I quickly added, I forgot to ask, do you want me to pick up something to eat for tonight? Her response was upbeat, that would be great, thanks for thinking about it. See you later. As I drove home, the weight of her lies began to crystallize. Passing by Mary's gift shop, I was drawn to a striking sign displayed in the window. It read, avoid even the appearance of indecency. I slowed down to study it, and before long, Marcy, the shop's attentive owner, approached me. Perhaps it was my badge, which she quickly noticed, as she remarked, there's a story behind this product, Officer Robbins. I explained that I liked the sign because my boss, Sheriff Stevenson, always stressed the importance of upholding one's reputation. I mused that it might even be a fitting addition to our conference room. Marcy then shared an unexpected story about the sign's previous owner, a woman named Janet. Janet had once been happily married to a man named Brad. At a company conference, she met an army captain named Steve, and they soon began collaborating on a project. Their daily lunches evolved into a close friendship, despite Brad's warnings when he saw them together at the Hilton. Janet ignored those warnings. In fact, their dinners together and occasional day trips eventually took on the hallmarks of an emotional affair. After the conference ended and Steve left, Brad's simmering anger only grew. Unable to contain his jealousy, he confronted Janet and even involved their children in the heated discussion. Despite Janet's insistence that nothing physical had occurred between her and Steve, Brad had already hired a private investigator who revealed that, at the very least, Janet's bond with Steve had crossed an emotional line, if not a physical one. Feeling betrayed and unable to trust her any longer, Brad ultimately decided to work overseas for a month. He hoped that the time away would allow him to reflect on their marriage, though he admitted that even if his decision led to divorce, their college-age children might ultimately understand. During Brad's absence, fate took an ironic turn. Janet, wandering through a gift shop, encountered not one but 4 signs emblazoned with the message, avoid even the appearance of impropriety. In a moment of painful self-realization, she understood that although her relationship with Steve had never become physical, it had ventured deeply into the emotional realm. Had she followed the advice these signs offered, perhaps she could have prevented the downfall of her marriage. In an effort to at least symbolically guard her integrity, she purchased all 4 signs and placed them in prominent spots around her home, the most prominent hanging at the foot of her bed, greeting her each morning and bidding her good night. But the signs could not change what was already set in motion. A few days before Brad's scheduled return, he called Janet with a voice full of anger. "What are you playing at?" he demanded. "While I'm here trying to salvage our marriage, you're still carrying on with your affair." Janet protested. "What are you talking about? I haven't had any contact with Steve since he left. He was supposed to go to Europe, he's already there. It was just a long-distance thing." Brad's tone only grew harsher. "There was never any romance then, and there is no romance now." The conversation ended with Brad announcing, "Janet, I've accepted a full-time job here and have filed for divorce. I'm asking for our assets to be split equally, except you'll keep your car and house immediately. I don't think you can get a better deal than this. Now, go to your captain, celebrate tonight, and sign the papers when they're done." With that, he hung up. After a long bout of tears, Janet called Fort Hood's Human Resources Department to confirm Brad's claims. It turned out that Captain Steve Snow was indeed stationed at Fort Hood. He had been there for several weeks. Soon enough, Janet found herself driving to confront Steve. But before that could happen, she returned to the gift shop and sold all 4 of the once meaningful signs, a symbolic final act of surrender amid her heartache. On the day her divorce became final, a surreal transformation occurred. Steve's ring replaced Brad's on her finger. "Goodbye, Brad," she whispered to herself as she adjusted to the new reality. "Hello, Steve." It was a reluctant new beginning, a final chapter closing on one marriage and the hesitant opening of another. Yet, even as she embraced this change, she resented the fact that Brad had never truly believed in her innocence. That very night, despite everything, she knew deep down that she could no longer crawl into bed with him, not when the truth of her double life had come crashing down.